He was tied to a tree and shot over 100 times. Hugo Figueroa was a businessman who owned Rancho La Misión, which was a well-known bull ranch in Mexico. He also organized rodeo events across the country and came from a famous family. Hugo was a nephew of legendary singer Joan Sebastian. On January 27th of 2019, Hugo was hosting a rodeo event in Michoacan, Mexico. Everything seemed normal until a group of armed men stormed the arena. His bodyguard tried to protect him but was shot and unalived almost instantly. Then, in front of everyone attending the event, the men kidnapped Hugo and forced him away. For days, his family and friends hoped that he would be found alive. But a week later, those hopes were destroyed when his body was found in a remote area covered in bullets. And things became even more horrifying. A disturbing video started circulating online of allegedly Hugo tied to a tree surrounded by those armed men. In the video, he could be heard screaming, "What did I do?" moments before being shot over 100 times. To this day, the exact reason why Hugo was targeted remains unclear.
This woman's murder is one of the most infamous cases in the UK. She was beaten and kicked to death because she was a goth. I'm True Crime Caitlin, and this is the murder of Sophie Lancaster. Sophie was born on the 26th of November 1986 and lived in Lancashire. Sophie was someone who really stood out within her local community. She was a part of the Gothic culture and she would dress alternatively. She had tattoos, piercings, she wore bright, beautiful colours in her hair, she wore bold makeup, dark clothes and sported tunnels in her ears. Her friends would describe her as fiery and feisty, but also kind and sensitive. She was also really intelligent. She had a place at university where she was about to go to study English. She enjoyed spending time with her friends, going out, having some drinks together, or just chilling and listening to music. Sophie was in a relationship with a man named Robert Maltby. The couple had met through mutual friends, and soon they started spending every day together and got into a relationship. On the 11th of August 2007, Sophie and Rob were walking through Stubby Lee Park in Backup when they would be pounced on by a group of teenage thugs. The teenagers began hurling abuse at Sophie and Rob, and they just tried to ignore it up until one of the boys went over and out of nowhere, completely unprovoked, punched Rob. Rob tried to just brush it off and ignore it, tried to walk away, but the gang wasn't going to let him. The teens pounced on Rob and began to beat him, kicking him, punching him so viciously that he fell unconscious. Meanwhile, Sophie is pleading with the gang to just stop, please just stop hurting him, while she is cradling his head, trying to protect him. And that is when the gang turned on her. Sophie was barbarically beaten. She was stamped on with so much force that shoe imprints were left on her face, and she was repeatedly kicked in the head. Two of the teenagers were stood on either side of Sophie, and they are both kicking each side of her head like it is a football, tearing out some of her hair in the process. They did this until she too fell unconscious, and Sophie and Rob were covered in blood. There was actually so much blood that you couldn't tell where it was coming from, which injury was bleeding. The attackers were with a larger group of children, and after committing this horrifying beating, they all ran away, separating from each other. Some of them would gloat to other people that they met that night what they had done. One of them said, quote, "There's two moshers nearly dead up Backup Park. You want to see them. They're a right mess." Some of the other children who witnessed the horrific beating would call emergency services. When paramedics arrived, they couldn't initially tell who was Sophie and who was Rob. That is how catastrophic their injuries were. The couple both fell into comas. Rob would eventually come out of his coma, and he suffered from memory loss. He couldn't recollect parts of the attack. He would go on to make a full physical recovery, however he struggled for years mentally and emotionally. 13 days after the attack, Sophie's family were forced to make one of the biggest and most difficult decisions of their life. They decided to turn off Sophie's life support machine. Sophie Lancaster would die from her injuries in the hospital, and she was only 20 years old. In April 2008, 16-year-old Ryan Herbert was convicted of the murder of Sophie Lancaster. For this, he received a sentence of 16 years and 3 months in prison. This was later reduced by 9 months on appeal, and he was released in 2022 after making significant progress in prison. 15-year-old Brendan Harris was also convicted of Sophie's murder. He received a sentence of 18 years imprisonment, and as of December last year, he is eligible to apply for parole. 3 other young boys were convicted for their part in the attack of Rob, and each of those received sentences of between 4 to 5 years, meaning that all of them will be free now.
He picked up 2 knives from the kitchen drawer, then calmly pulled out the cable for the landline to stop her calling for help. Before we get into today's case, I have a bunch of deep dives on loads of other different cases on my podcast, The Born Investigation, and I post a brand new episode every single week. It was New Year's Day 2020 in Duffield in Derbyshire. Helen Almley and Reese Hancock seemed like the perfect match. They both worked in education, Helen as a PE teacher and Reese as a head teacher, and they just seemed like they had so much in common. Helen was such a friendly, welcoming person, always up for a laugh. She had no issue making new friends. And the pair ended up getting together and started dating, and they were together for years and years and had 3 kids together. To the outside world, everything seemed perfect. But we know by now that things can look very different on the outside as to what's going on behind closed doors. Life had been hell for Helen. Police were constantly being called, ambulances showed up after accusations of DV. For Helen, it felt like every single time she tried to leave, Reese just would not let her. It was relentless. At one point, they actually properly split up, but Reese was then arrested for throwing something at her in a rage. It was like every single time she left him, he found a way to make her life even more unbearable, so it was actually kind of better off just being with him. Anyway, they fully, properly split up and hadn't been living together since October 2019. But Reese was still simmering beneath the surface, and he was about to get some news that would make him blow. He heard Helen had moved on, as she's absolutely entitled to. She'd started dating this lovely guy called Martin Griffiths. After years of living in a actual nightmare, she was finally happy. But that New Year's Eve, Reese calmly made a decision. He was living at his mum's house at the time, Denise, and she knew what he could be like. She'd seen it with her own eyes. She'd seen how he could suddenly just switch, just flip. And that night he told her, "I feel like I want to kill them." He grabbed 2 knives from the kitchen drawer and calmly pulled out the cable for the landline to stop his mum calling for help, then silently left the house. Now, Denise was shaking. She knew he was serious. She knew he was out to do something absolutely terrifying. She was scrambling all over the house trying to find a mobile phone to call for help. When she finally got her hands on it, her shaky fingers dialed 999. She begged, "Please, you need to go. He has 2 knives and he's on his way there." Now, the operator was like, "You need to ring Helen to warn her," but when Denise tried, the line was dead. Just 15 minutes after Denise had rang police, so did Reese. He calmly announced, "I have just murdered my wife in her bed. I have stabbed them and slit their throats. There is blood everywhere." How do you do that to the mother of your children? Like, knowing your children are going to have to live their lives without their mum that they adored. And a complete stranger too, like somebody who you hadn't even had a conversation with. Absolutely insane to me, just like to kill these 2 people in the most brutal way possible. When police raced over there, they were faced with a blood-soaked Reese who was pretty casual about the whole thing. He casually shrugged and said, "I'm hardly going to deny it, look at me." He had stabbed Helen 66 times and Martin 37. Do you know how violent of a person you have to be to do that? He'd crept into their house while they were sleeping. Martin was a lovely man. Everybody who knew him said he just had so much time for everybody in the local community. Like I said, Helen was a lovely, amazing mum and teacher, and she deserved the best. Reese was given a minimum of 31 years in prison, but is that even justice?
He had his teeth knocked out with a hammer and was forced to eat his own testicle, and yet those are only some of the horrific things that this man had to endure. I'm True Crime Caitlin, and this is the murder of Jimmy Prout. Due to the many graphic descriptions within this case, this is going to be a shorter TikTok version. However, if you want to hear this harrowing case in its entirety, you can do so by heading over to my podcast, True Crime with Caitlin, where I've uploaded a full episode on this case. In February 2016, Zahid Zaman would receive a text message from one of his girlfriends telling him that she had been awake all night long. That 45-year-old Jimmy Prout had kept her awake. Zahid, along with one of his other girlfriends, headed over to an address on St. Stephen's Way in North Shields, with intentions of going to shut Jimmy up, to silence him. Over the course of the past couple of months, Zahid and both of his girlfriends, Kate and Myra, along with another woman named Anne, inflicted the most sadistic, barbaric, torturous acts on innocent Jimmy. Jimmy and Anne were actually a couple who met one another within a soup kitchen in Newcastle. At this point in time in his life, Jimmy was going through a very rough patch. His relationship of 14 years had just broken down, he wasn't able to see his 2 children, and he was experiencing homelessness. This was of course a very vulnerable time in Jimmy's life, and so when Anne opened up her home to him, offering him to come and move in with her, he of course happily said yes. Unbeknownst to Jimmy, however, he was walking into what was later dubbed the North Shields Death Cult. The cult would treat Jimmy like their lackey, as if he was some sort of slave for them. He was forced to do all of the domestic things across both of the homes that everyone lived in. So he was responsible for cooking, cleaning, maintenance, gardening, and they had stupidly high expectations. If Jimmy wasn't able to meet these expectations, he would be punished. He would be starved. He would have food withheld from him. He would have to endure horrific beatings. He was stabbed. He had his teeth knocked out, and he had to endure the most barbaric, degrading things that I have honestly ever came across. When I read these details, I just could not believe that human beings are capable of doing this to someone else. It is absolutely sickening. All of those, along with many other things that I won't be able to detail on this app. This happened over a period of months, and Jimmy is eventually getting weaker and weaker. In his own way, he tried calling out for help. He posted photos of himself on Facebook that were very hard to look at. They show him with his teeth missing, black and blue in bruises, and so starving that he is almost skeletal. He would add captions on such as, "My mouth hurts and my body hurts." For Jimmy, this was his way of crying out for help, but no one heard him. No one came to help him. On that evening in February 2016, Zahid Zaman arrived at the home on St. Stephen's Way, where Jimmy had spent all night crying out in pain. It was actually Anne who came up with the idea of creating a makeshift gag. She tied a pair of trousers around Jimmy's mouth, and potentially unknowingly, she had also covered his nose, meaning that Jimmy couldn't breathe. It would be just over an hour later that one of the women who were living in that house went to check on Jimmy, only to discover that he was dead. Using a wheelchair, the cult transported Jimmy's body to what was described as some wasteland near their home, and that is where they left him. That is where he lay for 6-ish weeks until he was finally discovered. His body was actually only discovered because of the perpetrators being arrested, and one of them confessing to what they had done to Jimmy, but also where police could find him. During those 6 weeks, his body had heavily decomposed and had partially been consumed by animals. Because of this, they weren't able to determine a cause of death for Jimmy, but what was clear as day, what was apparent across his body, were the signs of the horrific torture. Abrasions and stab wounds to his skin, signs of malnourishment, and a missing testicle. What was inflicted on Jimmy was later compared to something from the Dark Ages. Zahid, Kay, Myra and Anne were all arrested, charged and convicted for their connection with Jimmy's murder. They were all found guilty of their charges and received sentences varying from 33 years to serve to 9 years to serve, which I think is astonishingly low for what they did to Jimmy. Jimmy's older brother Eddie believes that Jimmy didn't get justice. He has since forgiven one of the killers and has said that he doesn't want Jimmy to be forgotten. Again, this is a very graphic, barbaric, horrifying case, and so what I'm actually able to talk about on this app is extremely limited. If you want to hear this case in its entirety, not just what happened to Jimmy, but who he was as a person, you can do so by heading over to the True Crime with Caitlin podcast, which is available wherever you stream.
This is easily one of the most disturbing and sick cults out there that is still active today, and there is a very good chance that you have never even heard about them before. The Children of God cult. I just need to warn you that the crimes committed in this cult against children, babies, infants will deeply disturb you. This cult also had quite a few famous members, so we have a lot to go over. David Berg was born on February 18th, 1919 to a couple of very religious extremist parents. David Berg's mother was a self-proclaimed prophet herself and a divine healer. She was actually the first woman in America to be an evangelist preacher. She even had her own radio show where people would pay real money to call into her show, and then she would heal them like over the radio waves. And of course, his mother was later outed as a fraud and a scammer. David Berg's mother, very religious, of course, thought that one of the worst sins there was to touch and pleasure yourself. And when she caught her 5-year-old son, David, doing this to himself, she threatened to cut off his member. But when she later caught David doing this again as a teenager, she forced her son to finish in front of his mother and father. David would also claim when he was a child, he had a babysitter that would put him to sleep at nap time by SAing him. And he would later do the same thing to the children in his cult, like his own daughter. She said that her father would put her to sleep by, quote, front rubbing her. Sick, like so sick, I'm sick to my stomach sick. A lot of abuse that David suffered as a child, he would then go on to do to other people in his cult. He claims that his mother used to wear no clothes and cuddle him, and he would later say that one of his biggest regrets was not sleeping with his own mother. And he would later go on to SA his own family members and would force his cult followers to sleep with their own family members and their own children. A lot of David Berg's life was very unremarkable. He was a very unsuccessful person. He got married, he had children, he became an ordained minister for a little bit, but not for long. And then in the 1960s, him, his wife, and his children moved to California, where a lot of the hippies were, and that's how he started his cult. He would offer free coffee and free food to a lot of these young hippies that had no money, no place to live, and were far away from their families. And then when he had their trust, he would indoctrinate them into his cult. And he would, of course, tell his cult followers that he was a prophet of God, so he was getting all of his messages directly from God, so his word was God's word. And at first, a lot of his preachings were about morality and about purity, but as the years went on, David's preachings just became David saying that God told him that he should sleep with every woman, teenager, and child. So he is a PDF file. He would force members of his own family to sleep with him. So this is SA. He would force his sons' wives to sleep with him. And then he would force the rest of his family to just do things with each other. And then he would force his cult followers to do things with their own family members and their children. David Berg's cult, the Children of God, would go worldwide. They had thousands of members in hundreds of communities across dozens and dozens of countries. David knew that he wasn't the most charming or attractive man, so he would send out the most beautiful women in his cult to go out fishing for new wealthy men to join his cult by sleeping with them and flirting with them, and David would call this flirty fishing. And one of these flirty fishers was this woman named Karen Zerby, who will be very important in this case, unfortunately. Karen was brought into this cult by David's wife, and David liked her so much that he married Karen instead and then just sent his wife away. This cult was obviously also a doomsday cult, because is your cult even a cult if your cult leader isn't telling you that the world is going to end soon and the only way to save yourself is by joining his cult and listening to his every word? And it was through this fear that David got away with all the evil things he was doing to these people. and to their children. The Children of God cult would actually have a lot of famous members. Musician Jeremy Spencer would actually leave the band Fleetwood Mac to join the Children of God cult in 1971, which opened up room eventually for Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks to join the band in 1974. It's definitely really weird to think that we might not have the songs Silver Springs and Dreams if the Children of God cult didn't exist. There were also quite a few families that joined the cult with young children, or these children were born into the cult that later grew up to be celebrities, like Rose McGowan or Joaquin and River Phoenix. David's wife, Karen Zerbe, was out flirty fishing one day where she slept with 80 men at the same hotel, and she actually got pregnant from this, and they had a son that they named Ricky. And David actually became convinced that Ricky was the next prophet sent from God, like he was Messiah. And the abuse that this young boy went through is absolutely horrific, and all of the abuse that this young boy endured is actually completely documented in a book that the cult went on to publish themselves as like a recommended guide on how to raise a child in like God's name and God's vision. Ricky was SA'd by members of his cult since he was 17 months old. And when Ricky was a toddler, a female member of this cult handed over her 7-year-old daughter to Ricky for him to SA whenever he wanted. And of course, Ricky is a child. He does not know what he's doing, and he is actually being pressured and forced to now victimize other children. And Ricky's mother, David's wife, Karen Zerbe, would also force Ricky, her son, who is a child, to sleep with her as well. And Karen actually got so jealous over her own son when her husband David picked a wife for Ricky, which was actually David's granddaughter, a young girl named Mary. Karen got so jealous that she sent the young girl to one of their communes in the Philippines and forced the members there to abuse and torture and SA this girl, and she was often just handcuffed to a bed for like 6 months at a time. By the 1980s, the cult had grown so much that it had over 8,000 members in over 80 different countries. And then in 1994, at 74 years old, David Berg would die from natural causes, and his wife Karen Zerbe would step up to the plate and would now be the Children of God cult's new leader. By this time, Ricky was an adult and he had already escaped the cult, but he was suffering so much with all the abuse that he had suffered since infanthood. Unfortunately, so many members of the Children of God cult that ended up leaving, especially children that were either born or raised in the Children of God cult, really suffered through adulthood. Many ex-members of this cult would really suffer with substance use, very severe depression, and a lot of them actually ended up bringing an end to their own lives. One of David Berg's own sons actually brought an end to his own life by jumping off of a mountain. So Ricky started to think the only way to bring an end to this cult's terror was to kill their leader, who was now his mother, Karen Zerbe. Ricky did not know where his mother, Karen Zerbe, was at the time, so he ended up luring one of the higher up female members of this cult named Angela Smith to meet up with him under the guise of him telling her that he was interested in actually re-entering the cult. And this woman, Angela Smith, was actually one of the women that would SA Ricky since he was a child and an infant. While Ricky was holding Angela hostage, he's trying to get the location from his mother out of her, but she's not talking. He's also trying to explain to her how awful the cult is and all of the terrible things that they all did to him. But throughout all of this, Ricky, I guess, just got so angry and so upset that he actually killed Angela by stabbing her to death. He then brought an end to his own life, which ends the tragic life of Ricky Rodriguez. Ricky actually ended up recording like an hour-plus long video talking about all the abuse in the cult, how terrible these people were, all the horrific things that they did to children, and how they deserved justice, and these evil people deserved terrible things. He really wanted revenge, and the video is available online. Suggest you guys seeking out and listening to it if you are interested, but it is very, very heartbreaking. And Ricky's mother, Karen Zerby, has never faced any legal repercussions, and she actually continued to be the cult leader until last year in 2025 when she retired. And this group still exists today. It has over 10,000 members in 80 different countries, but instead of calling them the Children of God, they now go by the name The Family International, and they claim to be a Reformed Christian church and not a cult that abuses children anymore. This case is insane, and I'm really surprised that more people do not know about this. Please let me know all your thoughts and opinions in the comments, but I'm pretty sure I already know what you guys are going to think about the terrible people in this case. Please let me know, have you ever heard of this cult before? Let me know all your thoughts and opinions in the comments, but while you're there, please always remember to be respectful because there are potentially thousands of victims in this case, thousands and thousands and thousands of victims in this case. So while you're in the comments, just please remember all of the thousands and thousands of people that were affected in this case. Please remember Ricky Rodriguez and all of the just the very tragic life that that young man had. I feel so awful for him. Just please always remember that while in the comments, and while you're there, please let me know what case you want to see me cover next. Thank you to everyone that suggested that we covered this case today, and I will see you guys all next time in my next video. Happy Friday, and please be a good person to your fellow person.
He got inside this bag, put it into his bathtub, zipped it up, somehow padlocked it from the outside without leaving behind any fingerprints, and then ended his own life. At least that's what the police say happened, but I'm not buying it. This is Gareth Williams. He was a 31-year-old MI6 agent with the Secret Intelligence Service, as well as a junior analyst with the GCHQ, which, if you don't know, is the government communications headquarters. In the summer of 2010, he disappeared for an entire week, and somehow none of the officers at his job noticed. He was then found naked in the fetal position, stuffed inside of this bag, which was found in his bathtub. But get this, the bag was zipped up, the Velcro handles had been tied, and it was padlocked from the outside. When I tell you that almost everything about this case doesn't add up, I mean it. Police say that he probably just accidentally died on his own. But if there's ever a case that screams cover up, it's this one. So let's talk about it. Like I said, this is Gareth Williams. He was originally from Anglesey, Wales, and he was incredibly smart. He studied mathematics at Bangor University, and he graduated with a first-class degree at only 17 years old. Gareth then went on to get his PhD at the University of Manchester, where he eventually took a job with the GCHQ in 2001. Not much is really known about Gareth and his life, other than the fact that he was really outdoorsy and loved to cycle. He was described as an intensely private person, and he always stuck to routine. And a great example of that is the fact that he rented the same single room for nearly 10 years of his life, even though he totally had the means to have something bigger and maybe even a bit nicer. But his private personal life didn't just end there. We also don't know much about what he did for work, given the high-profile nature of his job. Some sources say that his work concerned Russia, and others say that he'd been helping the US National Security Agency trace international money laundering routes that are used by organized crime groups. This included Moscow-based mafia cells. Other reports say that his work involved hacking and other things of that nature. But whatever it was that he was doing, it was kept under wraps and very tightly sealed. By August of 2010, he was living in a safe house in Pimlico, London, used by Britain's intelligence services. He was in his own flat on the top floor, and by all accounts, it was pretty nice. But Gareth didn't really like it, and he actually put in a transfer request to go back home so that he could be more in the country and less in the city. This request was approved, which he was really excited about because that meant that in September of 2010, he would be able to make that move. But sadly, he never got the chance to do that, as he would suddenly and very mysteriously die in that very safe house. Gareth was last seen alive via CCTV on August 14th, 2010. He was walking down Sloane Street near a Dolce & Gabbana store, and then he was seen later that same day walking back to his flat. 2 days later, his computer was logged into a cycling website. But after this, something happened and he vanished. His disappearance would somehow go unnoticed for an entire week, though. How that happened, given the nature of his job and how important it is, I'm not sure. But on Monday, August 23rd, his colleagues started to become worried as they couldn't get a hold of him. Apparently, Gareth was out of contact for several days, so they notified authorities to conduct a welfare check. When police entered Gareth's top floor flat, it was really eerie because everything was pristine. Nothing was out of the ordinary. There was no sign of forced entry or really anything wrong. But the only thing they found that was a little bit weird was that his heater was turned on at full blast. Mind you, this was midsummer, so it was already really hot outside. But now that you had the heat at full blast, it kind of created this sauna-like environment. It was really hot. But as the police combed through his house, they stumbled across his bathroom. bathroom. The lights were off, the shower curtain was drawn, but inside the bathtub, they found this, a red sports bag, zipped and padlocked from the outside. When they got it open, they discovered a gruesome sight. There was Gareth, his naked and badly decomposed body in the fetal position inside the bag. Right off the bat, investigators felt like something was really off. After conducting the autopsy, authorities believe that he died in the early morning hours of August 16th, so one entire week before he was found. And based on how badly he decomposed, largely thanks to the heat blasting in his flat, his cause of death and manner of death were undetermined. There were no injuries to his body or signs of a struggle, which is the weirdest part to me. There were also no drugs or alcohol found in his system. Given the circumstances, authorities immediately deemed Gareth's death as unexplained and very suspicious. The circumstances surrounding his death were so bizarre that even the FBI joined the investigation. So needless to say, a forensic examination of his flat and the bag were conducted, and the results are just so confusing and odd. So like I said earlier, there was no sign of forced entry, and there was no other DNA found in the house at all that pointed to someone else being there at the time Gareth died. There were absolutely no fingerprints on the rim of the bathtub or the padlock itself, not even Gareth's, which is crazy. And there were no gloves lying around or on Gareth's body. And the scene in the bathroom appeared so clean that investigators were worried that someone had wiped it down. Because how crazy is it that not even Gareth's fingerprints were found anywhere on the tub or on the padlock? I don't get how that happens, unless someone else did this to him and wore gloves. Another odd thing found at the crime scene was the key to the padlock, and it was found underneath Gareth's body, inside the bag with him. To me, that screams that someone else put him in that bag, whether he was unconscious or not. Then they threw the key in there, zipped it up, and locked it from the outside, and left him there to die. This evidence also led the coroner to believe that someone else was there at his flat that day that killed him. She already felt that way given how weird the situation was, but this evidence kind of backed it up for her. It's important to note that early on in the investigation, it was reported that DNA was found on his hand that did not belong to him, which at first was a good lead. But it later came to light that this DNA was contaminated from one of the forensic scientists, so really it was irrelevant. Fast forward to the end of 2010. This is when authorities released even more information that really turned this case upside down. So authorities announced that occasionally Gareth would spend about an hour on certain bondage websites. This wasn't a big deal because he wasn't like obsessed with it or anything, and no other porn was found on his computer. Like, this was a very occasional thing that he watched. But of course, this detail really stuck out to the public and tabloids just ran with it. Unfortunately, something that kind of just fueled this fire was the fact that nearly $30,000 worth of high-end women's clothing was found in Gareth's closet at the time he died. And then enters Gareth's old landlord, the one who he rented a room from for nearly a decade. According to her, she once found him screaming for help, and when she went into his bedroom, she found him tied to the bedpost. He tried saying that he tied himself up to see if he could get free as kind of like a thrill thing. But according to her, it seemed more of like a sexual thing or even like a kink. But also, for the record, no shame. This took place about 3 years prior to his death. Right after this bombshell, the heads of the Secret Intelligence Service and the Metropolitan Police started butting heads over who was going to lead this investigation. Their main concern was to not let any details about Gareth's profession be leaked to the public. They wanted to keep what he did super tight-lipped and on lock, and there were even signed certificates by the foreign security to ensure nothing got out. It was crazy. The main question was how Gareth got into this bag, why, and how exactly he died. There were a few main theories. One was that Gareth got inside the bag himself, completely voluntary, somehow locked it without leaving behind any fingerprints anywhere, and then died, all accidentally. And he either did this for the thrill, maybe to see if he could escape, or some think that it could have been done as sort of a sexual kink. Another theory was that maybe he was killed by a professional for whatever reason, given how well they were able to leave behind no evidence. So this led to a 2012 inquest, which led to even more mystery. So at the inquest, an expert was brought in to examine the bag that Gareth's body was found in, and they concluded that it was virtually impossible for Gareth to have locked himself inside that bag. They said that if he was alive, he possibly got inside the bag voluntarily, but if not voluntary, then he was placed in the bag unconscious and locked in. Furthermore, 2 other experts were brought in at the coroner's inquest, and they attempted to lock themselves into a similar bag. Together, they tried over 400 times to try and pull this off, but every single attempt, they failed. A couple of pathologists were also brought in to give their 2 cents. One said that it seems more likely that Gareth was alive when he went into the bag, just based on the position of his corpse when found. I guess it would have been hard to position a dead body like that after the fact. fact. Another pathologist said that one theory of how he could have possibly died was from hypercapnia. He thought that if Gareth was alive when he was inside the bag, he would have been overcome with elevated carbon dioxide levels and fast. Basically CO2 poisoning, and this would have happened within the first 2 or 3 minutes. What's also super interesting is that other things came to light as a result of this inquest, particularly about his work. It was discovered that Gareth was one of many intelligence officers on a team sent to penetrate US and UK hacking networks. He also attended a number of DEF CON conferences, and if things couldn't get any crazier, well, buckle up. So in the final days of the 2012 inquest, so now 2 years after Gareth was found dead, a new bombshell was leaked, and it is insane. So in the days after Gareth was found, a CIS agent went into his office and found some questionable things, specifically 9 memory sticks in a container and a North Face bag similar to the bag that Gareth was found in. But instead of turning these things over to authorities, they held onto these memory sticks for 2 years. Until the end of the inquest. According to them, they said they contained information that was irrelevant to the investigation, so they didn't think to hand them over sooner. But now, 2 years had passed, and I'm sure if there was anything important on those memory sticks, it was long gone at this point. If that doesn't scream suspicious, I really don't know what does. The result of the inquest is at least something I can get behind. The coroner found Gareth's death to be unnatural and likely to be criminally mediated. After going through every possible scenario of what could have happened, they were confident that Gareth was killed unlawfully. Unfortunately, there was insufficient evidence to give a verdict of unlawful killing, but authorities concluded that another person placed the bag with Gareth in it into the bathtub, and then they locked it. They believe that Gareth was likely still alive when he was placed inside the bag, but that he died shortly after from CO2 poisoning, like I mentioned earlier. But they also provided another possible cause of death that is honestly really creepy. They also suggested that Gareth could have been killed from a short-acting poison. Ultimately, without hardly any answers, despite it seeming like Gareth was murdered, to this day, this case remains unsolved. It's now considered a mysterious cold case, but the coroner did state that his interest in bondage and the women's clothes that were found in his flat had nothing to do with the motive of his death. This specific finding didn't sit well with the Metropolitan Police, though. They ended up reinvestigating this case for a second time, which lasted 12 months. They re-examined all the evidence and even investigated new leads, but they still had no conclusive explanation for his cause of death. They went on to say, quote, "The most probable scenario is that he died alone in his flat." End quote. They think that he accidentally locked himself inside the bag and that this was all just a tragic accident, that no foul play was involved, even though this theory seems logically impossible. In September of 2015, sources in Russia claimed the Russia Foreign Intelligence Service, commonly known as SVR, was responsible for his murder. They said that the SVR tried and failed to blackmail Gareth into becoming a double agent. When this didn't work, Gareth responded to the SVR that he knew the identity of a Russian spy inside the GCHQ, and then they killed him to protect their agent. This source said the SVR killed Gareth by, quote, "an untraceable poison introduced into his ear." End quote. How true that is, though, I'm honestly not sure if we will ever really know, but it seems like it could be a possibility. This case was reviewed once again in 2024 by the Metropolitan Police, but again, they found no new findings of DNA, or that anyone else was ever in his flat that day. Although we don't really know what happened to Gareth that day, some people, including his family, believe that it's entirely possible that he was killed by a member within the Secret Intelligence Service, and that this could be one giant cover-up. At this point, I'm not ruling anything out, because absolutely nothing about this case makes sense. But what do you guys think? Do you think he climbed into the bag himself, or do you think someone else killed him? I'm incredibly curious to know your thoughts, but it's now been 16 years, and whatever happened to Gareth inside that bag that day remains a mystery.
I don't know if she was being abused, but I do know that she was murdered by her fiance, and not knowing if he'll be sent to jail for the rest of his life really isn't sitting right with me or her family. So this woman's name is Laura Cardenas. She's 51 years old, living in Ridgeway, Virginia with her fiance, Adam Hughes. Laura is a very hardworking woman who isn't the type to just slack off or skip work for no reason. So on October 25th, 2023, when she didn't show up to work for like 2 or 3 days in a row, her co-workers really started to worry. And so they decide to call the police, report her missing, and ask to do a wellness check, just to make sure that everything was all right. So the police head on over to Laura's house, where they see her fiance Adam at home just chilling. And not thinking anything of it, police ask him, hey, when's the last time you seen your fiance Laura? Her kids and coworkers are really worried for her. She's been MIA for like 2 days. And this creature that's currently taking up space responds with, oh yeah, actually it's so weird. I haven't seen her since like the 21st. That's like what, 4 days ago? What an odd thing to say. So you haven't seen your fiance in almost a week, yet the first person to call 911 was her coworker. Oh, okay. Anyways, police found that a bit odd, so they jot down his response, they go back to the police station, and they file a freaking warrant to search his property because there is no way that they're gonna let that slide. And so the next day, they arrive back to Adam and Laura's house with all of the officers ready to search the place, and sure enough, after a few hours of digging around, they find something. Inside of both their home and Adam's truck was human blood splattered all over, and these officers are thinking, oh no, we're dealing with something way worse than we thought. So they collect the blood samples and then they store it away for safekeeping, and then they start doing their digging on Laura and Adam's relationship. And boy, oh boy. It took a lot of digging for me to find this, so it almost feels like he didn't want us to know, but it turns out that back in December of 2022, Adam was being charged for some sort of domestic violence assault against Laura. But then all of a sudden, she took back her statement and the case just went cold. So my question is, did Adam force her to stay quiet? Because 1 year later, we've got a car and a house full of blood, a woman who's been missing for like 4 days, and a man who couldn't give two shits about reporting his fiance missing. So by this point, investigators are putting all of their attention on Adam, asking themselves things like, okay, where was he the last couple of days? Does he look like he's been hiding something? So these detectives decide to use their computers and special technology tools to follow everywhere Adam has gone for the past week. They're tracking his cell phone data, his GPS data from his car, surveillance footage along the routes. I mean, they're going all in. And you know what? It was all worth it because it led them straight to South Boston, Virginia, a town that's about 30 miles away from where Laura lives. And so detectives drive out there with a bunch of other officers and they start searching this super wooded area right next to some back road. And unfortunately, but fortunately, they found Laura's remains thrown on the dirt ground. It was as if her presence on this earth meant nothing, as if her family wouldn't have cared, as if people wouldn't have noticed her missing. Oh my God, that just breaks my heart. So the forensics team transfer her remains to the lab, and of course, they test it. For one, they had to make sure it was her, and it was. But for two, investigators wanted to see if the blood that they found inside of Adam's truck and inside the house would match Laura's DNA. And after hours, probably days of waiting, they find that the blood inside of the house and the car did in fact match Laura. And so with all of this evidence, police finally had enough to arrest this sicko. And that's exactly what they did. But 2 years later, so as of today, Adam Hughes is still awaiting trial and has not been found guilty of Laura's murder. So my question is, can her name be yelled loud enough to make sure that this evil monster stays locked up? Or is this gonna be another case of a woman silenced by domestic violence and never brought to justice?
A girl goes on a trip to Japan and then never makes it home. What actually happened to Sky Budnick? Sky Budnick was 21 years old and attending Central Connecticut State University at the time of her disappearance. She was studying Japanese and international business, and she was living with her parents in Salington, Connecticut. And she had two siblings, a brother and a sister who posts here on TikTok named Megan LeBron. Her mother described her as a very quiet and shy girl. She loved anime, loved the Japanese culture, and she had actually never traveled outside of Connecticut before, which I thought was really interesting. Sky had struggled making friends throughout her life, and she spent a lot of time at home. It wasn't until she started attending CCSU that everything really changed. She was among more people that were similar to her, who liked anime, who liked Japanese culture, and it really made a difference. She even joined a Japanese pop culture club in school. However, her family started to realize before her disappearance that she was starting to struggle again. They realized that she really was only attending college to be a part of that club, and she was failing all of her classes. She had actually wanted to study abroad in Japan, but she wasn't able to because she didn't have the grades, and her mental health was starting to deteriorate a bit
but she was not somebody that would just ask for help if she needed it. In January of 2008, Sky's mother would receive a call from the airport in Connecticut, and they were saying that Sky was supposed to be boarding a flight, but Sky said she didn't buy a ticket. She was just looking up study abroad information. It wouldn't be until after she disappeared that they would find out she did, in fact, buy a ticket to go to Japan, but just ended up not boarding at that time. An interesting detail that her sister has talked about is on March 31st, 2008, Sky asked her mother to make her favorite cupcakes. And her sister Megan was like, "You can make them yourself, Sky." And Sky just smiled and said, "I wanted her to make them one last time," which is really eerie now that we know what happened. But at the time, they just thought she was joking. Sky would tell her parents that she was planning to stay with one of her friends in her dorm room. But when she didn't come home by April 3rd, they started getting concerned. So they tried to get a hold of her. They couldn't get a hold of her. They called her siblings. They hadn't heard from her. They started calling around to her friends, and they hadn't heard or seen her. And they couldn't find anybody that she was staying with. Nobody had heard from her at this point, and it was very concerning. Her brother went through the computer's history, and they would find a booking confirmation for a flight that Sky had took on April 1st, and she would fly from Connecticut to Virginia's International Airport to Tokyo, Japan, and finally Sapporo. They would go to her room and determine she really didn't take that much. Her laptop and Nintendo DS were missing, but that's all they could really determine. They would notify the police of this, and they had a hard time just because she was in another country. And they would even find out that with Japan's laws, they would have to go to Japan to make a missing persons report. So they start off by going to the airport to see if they can find her car, which they do, and it doesn't really give them any clues to anything. So they do end up boarding a flight to Japan that same week. Law enforcement met them at the airport to take the missing persons report, and then the family would really hit the ground running. They had missing persons flyers created that were in English and Japanese that they were handing out, and law enforcement even had helicopters that were flying around looking for her, but they couldn't find her anywhere. They also were getting kind of concerned because they couldn't find out why she would have went to Sapporo in the first place, and they still don't even know this. The only thing that they can really think of is maybe somebody convinced her to go there. They would hold a press conference and eventually get some leads. Sky had been seen in Noboribetsu, which is about an hour or so from Sapporo, and she was seen checking out of an inn on April 7th. This would be the last time anybody saw Sky, though. As of May 2026, Sky Budnick has not been found. Her family continues to search for answers on what may have happened to her. There is concern that she met somebody online who convinced her to go there and then something bad happened. But if you have any information regarding the disappearance of Sky Budnick, you can contact the Southington Police Department at 860-378-1698, and they will work with the Japanese law enforcement. Thank you for listening to Sky's story. Be sure to follow for more true crime. And if you have any case recommendations, feel free to comment them or directly message me.
How are you able to murder someone, get out of prison, and then go on to get 2 degrees? And when you hear how she set this whole thing up, okay, so it is October 1997, and Anu Singh decides that she wants to have a dinner party, and she tells all of her friends, her law student friends, that she wants to throw this party because she's feeling really bad about herself. She's been having a lot of health issues, and she thinks that she wants to take her own life. Boyfriend at the time, Joe Chinque, he's like, you know what? I'll do this with you. So she's telling all of her friends this. Only thing is that Joe doesn't know what this dinner party is all about. So Anu invites at least 12 friends over to this dinner party. They sit around, they have some wine, they have some conversation, and the plan was that she was going to slip a roofie into her coffee and Joe's coffee, and then she was going to inject heroin into her boyfriend Joe. Only problem is that her guest didn't know that she wasn't going to do anything to herself. She was just going to take Joe's life. But what my question is, why were all of these people there? What kind of people are these? These are law students. They're pretty smart, right? They all went to the party, not once, but twice. And let me tell you why. Because the first time that she threw this party, she tried to inject her boyfriend after he was passed out with a syringe full of heroin, and she couldn't do it. It was coagulated. She didn't know what she was doing. So she's like, damn it. Let's call the party part 2. Party part 2 is coming up next. And all of her friends are like, okay, we'll come back again. Every one of them come back to the party again. And hi, my name's Chrissy. I have a podcast called Residue where I will go deeper into the story of Jo Ching-kway and Anu Singh. And again, Jo has no idea that this is happening. Now, she tells her friend, this is because I don't really feel good anymore and I don't want to be alive. And Jo doesn't want to be alive without me, so that's not the case. The case is that Jo was getting a little sick of her shit and Jo wanted out. And Jo was getting ready to move out. And instead of letting that happen, she was going to stop that any way she could. Again, her friends come over for the second time. They all leave, and they know what's going to happen when they leave. And this time, she roofies her boyfriend. He passes out. She waits because he doesn't wake up till the next day. And then the next day, she injects him with the heroin. And this time, no, she wasn't going to mess this up. She actually went to a drug dealer herself. She had him load the syringe, and she had him teach her how to do this. Very premeditated, this woman. She also had a friend. This friend's name was Madhavi Rao, and Madhavi helped with everything. Madhavi even tried to find a gun, because at first Anu thought, maybe I'll just shoot him. They couldn't find a gun, so they thought this heroin idea would be the best way. So she injects him with heroin, and then she waits a little while, and then she calls her friend, and her friend is like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like, call an ambulance. If you get in trouble, call an ambulance now. So Anu calls 911 after Jo's already been injected, and she gives them the wrong address. Makes it a lot more difficult for them to get there, and by the time they actually do, her boyfriend Jo has passed away. Her boyfriend Jo has been murdered. Jo Ching-kway was the eldest of Italian immigrants, and he was smart as hell, friendly as hell. He had such a close-knit group of friends. Jo flourished in and out of school. He earned himself a degree in civil engineering, and Jo never had a bad word to say about anybody. His friends couldn't believe that he was dating someone like Anu. Anu was the type of girl that was very narcissistic, and she had to be the center of attention. And, Jo got really sick of it. And Anu, she was the daughter of 2 doctors. She was incredibly intelligent. How she came up with this idea is beyond me. So Jo's home now becomes a crime scene. And this was a Sunday that this happened. Every Sunday, Jo called home to his parents. They had tea together over the phone and they would talk, and Jo didn't call. So this is so incredibly sad. His mother calls him and a police officer answers, and she's like, what is going on? And that is how she found out what happened. Because at the same time as she's on the phone with this police officer, police officers were at her door to tell her in person what happened to her son. And she knew it. She knew right away. She said she did it, didn't she? I know she did it. Jo's mom says something that just strikes me like to my core. Like, you have a child. You give birth to this child. You raise this child. You feed them. You take care of them. You look after them. You send them off into the world hoping that they find people that are going to also love them as much as you do and take care of them. She says, and then I have to put my son in a hole in the ground, and this woman gets to live. She gets to live her life. Now, Anu and Madhavi, they get caught. Her friend who helped set everything up, they choose, because in Australia at this time, you could choose to have a trial by judge or a trial by jury. They chose judge. And the judge let Madhavi walk. She just got to go. Nothing happened to her. She bought the heroin. She bought the roofies. She organized the party. She spoke to people bragging about what Anu was gonna do. She also knew what was gonna happen that day at that party, and she didn't tell anyone. She walked free. Anu Singh pleaded not guilty. She tried to claim diminished responsibility. She was caught saying to someone that it is not hard to convince someone, especially a jury and a judge, that you're insane. It's not hard to do that. So a witness came on the stand and told everyone that she had said that. The judge sentenced Anu to 10 years in prison with a minimum of 4 years to be served. And I want you to guess how many years she spent behind bars. She served 18 months. 18 months for organizing the death of her boyfriend, telling everyone about it, and carrying it out. After she was released, she completed a master's degree in criminology at Sydney University. And in 2012, she was awarded a doctorate for her thesis titled Offending Women Toward a Greater Understanding of Women's Pathways into and Out of Crime in Australia. Free woman, just walking the streets amongst us all.